Okay, everybody. If we can settle down, maybe we'd like to start the next part of the conference. But before I introduce the panel that who are going to be speaking to us, I'd like to call up Anne-Marie O'Brien from InterTradeIreland, who is our sponsor, just to say a few words. Thank you, Anne-Marie.
So yeah, good afternoon. As Philip mentioned, my name is Anne-Marie O'Brien and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of InterTradeIreland. As you know, InterTradeIreland is one of the 6 North-South implementation bodies established under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and we work on an all-island basis to promote trade and business development. So today's event is an example of how cross-border collaboration can be used to further develop the economies in both Ireland and Northern Ireland, and these partnerships will only continue to grow in importance in future years. As a cross-border body, InterTradeIreland plays a key role in supporting SMEs on the island of Ireland to continue to trade successfully and navigate the post-Brexit trading environment. We're funded by the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment in Ireland and the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland on a 2-to-1 ratio. We've been helping small businesses in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and as Bernadette said earlier, really the backbone of the economy. We've been helping them explore the cross-border market, develop new products, processes and services, and become investor-ready for over 2 decades. 2021 was a busy year for InterTradeIreland. Alone, we helped 4,000 businesses directly through our support and 2,000 indirectly through our range of programs. So we're divided. The way the organisation works is we have a trade section, innovation section, corporate services and strategy. In our trade section, what we try to do is obviously grow cross-border trade and sales, so we have a specific acumen programme for that. In terms of innovation, we have a number of supports there, one being our Innovation Boost programme, which supports product development and innovation by linking academics and SMEs on the island. And we also have a seed corn investor readiness competition, which is the largest competition of its kind for early stage high growth companies in any sector in Ireland, with a total cash prize fund of €300,000. We pride ourselves on being an agile organisation, so responding to what businesses are looking for. And we do this through, we have an all-island business monitor where we survey over 750 businesses on a quarterly basis. In the last monitor, we found that 86% of the business owners were saying that the major issue for them was rising energy costs. The second biggest issue was the price of overheads. The third biggest issue was skills. So we then that directly informs our work. So we quickly came forward with a business solutions voucher, which is offering businesses professional advice on how they can handle the rising energy costs, what maybe changes they have to make. So into the future, we're going to continue that agility and listening to what businesses want. So looking to the future, we'll continue to facilitate collaboration, build upon our impact by turning common challenges into opportunities. We'll be focusing on areas in digital technologies, e-business, adjusting to the low carbon economy, cybersecurity and fintech. So yeah, if you want to check us out, InterTradeIreland, our website or any of our social media, you can see the work that we do, or if you have any questions for me after, happy to answer them. So I'll pass you over to the chair now to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Mobility is the subject of the next hour of our discussion. I was talking to my good friend and colleague Michael Darcy before the conference started here this morning, and we were both commenting on the amount of traffic on the roads, he coming from Dublin direction and me coming from Belfast. The amount of traffic on the road as in my case at 7 o'clock in the morning coming down is purely anecdotal, and I don't have any statistics to back it up, but it seemed to me that the roads are a lot busier than the north-south road has been a lot busier than it was in a few years ago. So I actually checked, by the way, if I wanted to come in public transport here, and last night. I worked out it would have taken me about 3 hours, I think, to get here. So I might have just made this panel discussion, but it'd be interesting to see what the statistics are on the actual numbers of people moving backwards and forwards. I have a very distinguished panel with me today, coming from a variety of perspectives on the mobility issue. First of all, first to my right is Professor Anne Looney, who's Executive Dean of the DCU Institute of Education. And Anne comes particularly from the perspective in terms of cross-border mobility of collaboration on teacher education. Then next is Owen Reidy, Assistant General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, who has a particular interest in workers' rights across the island and the extent to which that affects worker mobility across the island. We then have Dr. Sheila Flanagan, Vice President and Registrar of the Dundalk Institute of Technology, who's in the unique position of being right on the spot here and can talk to us about her perspective particularly on student mobility and how that the benefits and issues related to student mobility. And finally, we have Sam Lowe, who's a partner at Flint Global. He's the Englishman, although he tells me he's actually Welsh. Sam has a very close knowledge of trade and trading patterns and the issues affecting the movement of goods onto the island of Ireland. So I'm going to look forward to what each of the panellists has to say from their different perspectives and see if there are any commonalities between us. So I'm going to start off with Owen. And Owen, in terms of workers' rights, with Brexit and the type of Brexit we have, do you see workers' rights across the island diverging as a result of that? And if so, how?
Yep, thanks very much, Philip, and very much appreciate being here. We come from the vantage point of being a very large civil society organisation on the island. Very proud of the fact that we're truly cross-community in Northern Ireland. I think that's really important, something that we want to cherish and protect. But we're very concerned with the type of Brexit that we've been saddled with, which I don't think is one of our own making. It's the ERG, hard right, that's taken over the Tory party. We're going to see divergence, not just on workers' rights, but a whole load of other issues. And that's going to affect us on the island of Ireland, notwithstanding devolution. And I think you only have to look at the post-COVID situation we find ourselves in. The role of the state, something that was required to be resourced to protect us in COVID. You're essentially seeing with the Brexit that the hard right and the Tories are pushing, as well as kind of Little Englander nationalism. It's about stripping back the state. And it's about taking resources from the state so that the state can't do what it needs to do. And I think that's why we're going to see a huge wave of industrial action in Britain and in Northern Ireland with this cost of living crisis. So I think the Brexit that we've found ourselves with, as well as ideological nationalism, it's much more fundamental about the role of the state. And it's I mean, you've got Rees-Mogg now as Minister for Business and Workers' Rights. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, they're talking now in Britain about things like the right to strike. And it's the most fundamental civil right any worker has to withdraw their labour. So I think when you look at workers' rights on the island of Ireland, and indeed across these islands, many of them emanate from progressive EU directives, particularly in the 80s. Things like the Working Time Act that we all take for granted, that's on the chopping board in Britain. Will that westerly wind blow over into Northern Ireland? And there are other things that many of us take for granted, health and safety legislation that could diverge. I think the one positive is that workers' rights and employment rights is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland, unlike Wales and Scotland. And I know from talking to my colleagues in Wales and Scotland who have somewhat progressive, definitely a progressive government in Wales and a somewhat progressive government in Scotland, they would love workers' rights and employment rights to be devolved. So it's a tool we want to use with the executive when it's restored to make sure that workers' rights in Northern Ireland don't fall behind. But the big issue, and I'll end on this, we have a directive which Taoiseach, who was here earlier on, is going to sign off next week, with his council colleagues on the 4th of October called the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. That will transform the EU 27. It will make collective bargaining, unions and employers negotiating on pay, a much more likely thing. It's going to drive collective bargaining coverage up to 80% across the EU. Britain will lose out on that. And our job is to make sure Northern Ireland doesn't.
Good. Okay. And does that impact on mobility then? If workers' rights are different in the two parts of the island, does it mean that it's more difficult for workers to find jobs?
Workers' rights and pay. I mean, I was involved in a meeting yesterday with the Northern Ireland Minister for Finance, and I was talking to an employer construction organisation, the CIF's equivalent in Northern Ireland. And their problem is that skilled labour from Northern Ireland in that sector commutes south. Why? Because the salaries are better. The Taoiseach mentioned the Shared Island Initiative in the ESRI report. Wonderful report on education done recently, but a previous report looked at pay, and when you take and you strip out cost of living and taxes and the role of the welfare state, or what's left of the welfare state, pay on average is about 20% better in the Republic of Ireland when you take everything else in the round. So people are voting with their feet, and you are seeing that mobility. And what we have to make sure is that Northern Ireland is a place where it has an economy that works for everybody, and where work pays. And for many it doesn't at the moment, and I think that's why you're going to see a wave of industrial action increasing as we get into the winter and beyond. Okay. So turning then to Sam, a different perspective. Sam, in terms of the movement of goods, the mobility of goods in and out of, particularly in and out of Northern Ireland. From your experience, what problems do companies face? Big question. What problems do companies face with the movement of goods in and out of Northern Ireland?
Thank you. It's a very easy question to answer. Not really. Anthony approached me, Anthony Suarez, who you probably all know if you're here, to do a paper on this for the annual journal that's coming out soon, and it's a question I find quite fascinating, and I should just emphasise that I'm really coming at this from the perspective of someone who's worked on international trade policy for a while, and whose interest in the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular has been piqued by the fact that you're talking about some quite unique arrangements that you can't actually find anywhere else. So even just observationally, it's incredibly interesting. I understand that it being interesting isn't necessarily what people want to hear if you're actually having to deal with that, and that there are lots of other issues surrounding it, around identity and the like, that I'm very much not qualified to speak about. But in terms of how goods move in and out of Northern Ireland, and whether the arrangement that we have now is good or not, the answer is it depends on what you're doing. It depends on what type of company you run. And I'm going to ignore services in this discussion, although we could have another panel on that as well. And the reason I say it depends is that, to my mind, if you're just talking about trading goods, you have to discuss 6 different borders in the context of Northern Ireland. You have to discuss goods moving into Northern Ireland from Great Britain. You have to discuss goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. You then have Northern Ireland into the EU. You then have the EU into Northern Ireland, and then you have Northern Ireland into the rest of the world, and then you have the rest of the world into Northern Ireland. And each of those borders treats goods slightly differently, or quite significantly differently. I mean, if we think about, so Northern Ireland to Great Britain, so something moving across, that's generally fine. If you're moving sort of endangered species, you might have some additional declarations to deal with. That's not such a huge problem. If that's your business, then you're generally okay. But if you're talking about the other way, Great Britain to Northern Ireland, as everyone is well aware, it's phenomenally complicated. And it's not just those issues that are known, the fact that you now have to deal with additional customs declarations, the fact that you've got checks on products of animal origin entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain and elsewhere. It's the ever-changing nature of the problem. If we think about the recent issues around steel movements within the UK, so from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and how that interacts with EU regulation governing tariff rate quotas in the event of trade defence measures, and the fact that a recent change to the EU approach triggered by the war in Ukraine led to duties having to be applied to steel moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. This is a moving issue, so you have to, if you're a business, you have to constantly monitor it. You have to look at what new EU regulation is coming down the line, for example, on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could see duties, in essence, applied to goods on the basis of their carbon content. That could, not will, could apply to goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and you have to work that out. But then you think about, say, Northern Ireland into the EU, that's pretty good. It's pretty easy. It's not the same as before. If, for example, you are producing products that require third-party certification, you can no longer rely on a Northern Irish or UK-based, as a whole-based certification body to sign that off, except under certain circumstances you'd need to rely on an EU body. But for the most part, you can trade as before. It's not a huge problem. EU into Northern Ireland is easy. That's not so much of a problem unless you're transiting through Great Britain, in which case there have been some issues, for example, with medicines and the like. But then when it gets quite fascinating is Northern Ireland to the rest of the world. So Northern Ireland is within the UK's customs territory to the extent it interacts with the rest of the world. And this is particularly true for exports. Northern Irish businesses can take advantage of UK free trade agreements. This is actually quite useful because the UK free trade agreements are generally more accommodating than the EU ones when it comes to incorporate, being allowed to incorporate Irish content. The rollovers actually allow for that, whereas the existing EU ones don't. It's easier to export from Northern Ireland under the UK free trade agreements in some instances than it would be to export under the equivalent EU agreement from Ireland. But when we talk about these trade agreements and how they interact with imports, you have another issue, which is if you're a Northern Irish business, you can take advantage of the new UK free trade agreements, for example, New Zealand, Australia, only under certain circumstances. Because the default is that the EU regime applies. However, if, for example, the product you're importing has a slightly lower tariff under the UK regime and it's within 3 percentage points and you're a trusted trader and there's no fear of onwards transfer into Ireland, then maybe you can take it's different. So you end up with these odd dynamics whereby Northern Irish exporters can actually export under the UK free trade agreements but can't import. Depending on your perspective, if you're a farmer, for example, that might be good or bad. Because you get the protection and the advantages, or if you're a consumer, it might be bad because you can't bring in cheaper products. I'm sort of over-labouring the point because I'm sort of saying, because I think collectively this complexity is an additional barrier to businesses being able to scale in Northern Ireland. Because if you are thinking about how do you develop, you've got your domestic market, you can only do so much. You've then got the Irish market and the EU market, you can scale a bit more. But actually navigating all of these different problems puts people off. It's just at a purely human level, you sort of think, well, can I be bothered to deal with all of this? And to sort of draw this to a close, because I know I'm going to get a question about potential solutions later. In terms of the long-term implication of this, my expectation is that Northern Irish firms will adapt. They will gradually reduce their exposure to the difficult bits and increase their exposure to the bits that are easier or even better than before. But this does, of course, have implications for trade flows and how people perceive Northern Ireland's economy should interact either with the EU or as part of the United Kingdom. But I'll draw it to a close there because I've sort of been rambling on.
Good. Okay. No, you certainly got across the complexity there of the situation. Sam, we'll maybe come back later on to talk about what possible solutions there are to it and the way forward. Turn next to Anne and ask a question about student mobility. Anne, I mean, the benefits of student mobility have been well documented, whether it's social, professional, or intercultural. How do you think we can capitalise on these as a kind of an all-island higher education ecosystem? And are there other more intangible benefits of mobility, student mobility, that we should consider?
I was going to respond by saying that's a very good question, Philip, but then I wrote it, so I just let some people to try and introduce that concept of thinking about student mobility and listen to Sam's description of the challenges, the kind of the different kinds of arrangements that are in place for going in and going out. it actually makes the issue of student mobility appear quite straightforward. I think, and especially on the island, if we think of it as a higher education ecosystem, and I think, or even a tertiary ecosystem, because we might also want to include further education and vocational education and training and consider that aspect of it. And the shift we've had to make, because we would have always considered a shared higher education and research ecosystem that would have involved the United Kingdom and Ireland, and we've had to kind of change mindset a little bit, and as we've begun to detach ourselves, unfortunately, from research agreements with UK universities that were supported previously by the European Union, and as student mobility becomes a little trickier, the new fees arrangements now in universities in England, for example, discouraging students in the Republic of Ireland from moving, whereas hitherto they would have gone quite quickly. I think we do look at the potential here, not just for students but academic staff as well in terms of mobility. Research shows that it has benefits for students and it has benefits for institutions. I think in recent times we've probably begun, I think we're underestimating some of those benefits. I'm always taken with the historian Charles Taylor and his concept of the social imaginary. You know, Charles Taylor came up with this phrase and said, effectively the social imaginary is simply your acceptance of how things are. This is how we do things here. And there's been quite a lot of post-pandemic writing that would say that one of the impacts of the pandemic has been that it challenged our social imaginary. If someone had told you we would actually have to remain in our homes or at best travel 2 kilometres from them, wear a mask, not speak to we couldn't have conceived of that. So the whole imaginary shifted. I think that what mobility does, what moving institution or course or exchange or whatever it might be, as a staff member or as a student, but connecting up with another institution and moving, it challenges your imaginary. Because you see how you see the world, and you see how somebody else sees the world, and it is inevitably different. There's a line in the Quran that says one of the great mercies of Allah is the joy of difference, right? You begin to see things differently, and it is, as universities, as people approach, certainly before the pandemic, and I think there was certainly a shift, people approaching higher education as simply a stepping stone to a salary, taking a very technicist view of my higher education. Look, just give me the qualification and get me out of here, right? You know, I'm going to spend 3 years in your university, I'm paying you for a qualification, the job is to get me credentialed and get me out. I think mobility challenges that. I think it makes you think more about your educational experience. I think as an academic, it challenges you into a space of dialogue. And in all our institutions, and Sheila, I'd be interested to hear from you on this one as well, in all of our institutions, we're looking at interdisciplinarity, and we're looking at those elusive transversal skills that are important in business as well. Not just what you learn in your French degree or your education degree, but how you learned to learn, how you developed resilience, commitment, and perseverance in your learning. And I think that mobility, experiences of movement, experiences of challenge, develop some of those skills. And I think we're, as a system, I think as an island, it behoves us to begin to look at those. You look at the challenges you outlined it for us earlier this morning, the global challenges that we find ourselves facing as an island people. And it is about the water and the biodiversity. And whatever about the political differences and the trade challenges and the workers' rights issues that are there, those global challenges, we are going to face them as an island, and we are going to face them as a shared island. So solutions to those, responses to those, in which universities play a key role. I think we really need to think about mobility more in that context, and perhaps, and I think it's happening anyway, but less as a tick box on the CV, you know, that an employer looks for, less as saying a kind of well, as part of my program, I did a chunk of my program somewhere else, but actually really beginning to build in those kind of mobilities because they challenge your social imaginary, and they're going to make you better able to deal with those kind of global challenges. I think it's very easy to go to school in your community, and we don't have a great tradition in the south, certainly, of moving too far from your home to go to your higher education. So it's very easy to stay with the same people, the same class, the same colour, move to university, same people, same class, same colour, same language. You meet a lot of the same. Mobility, and we're privileged in the Republic. We have a lot of European mobility. Students just the Erasmus schemes that are so historic in forming people's views of European Union in Ireland. But I think so. We have that tradition, but I think we could be doing more on a shared island basis.
Yeah, good. The challenge to the social imaginary. That's a challenging one. All right, Sheila. Turning to you and the on the ground in Dundalk. Could you give us your perspective on what cross-border student mobility is looking like at present, particularly in terms of what it is in this particular area today, and what are the enablers for the mobility, and what are the challenges?
I think, thank you. And by the way, on your transport question or comment earlier at the start, I've been commuting from North County Dublin to Dundalk for the last 4 years. I'm here 4 years, and I can tell you that the traffic both ways on the road, apart from the pandemic period, has absolutely increased. So there's a lot of mobility and a lot of traffic back and forth. Turning to I suppose, maybe focusing on undergraduate education, and where I'm based, which is literally almost within this complex, we have students from both sides of the border, from this region, who attend for higher education. But there are challenges, and we've heard about some of those this morning, and they've always been there. They've been there since before Brexit. They've been there since before the pandemic. And I would say that the number one challenge is lack of information about each other. Is really a huge obstacle that we need to get over. And I'm being very specific now and just looking at the undergraduate, the person who's doing their A-levels or doing their Leaving Cert, and they want to make a choice. Students in the Republic of Ireland know very little about the education system in Northern Ireland or in England, Wales or Scotland. The Northern Irish student, for example, who are the ones on our doorstep here, know very little about us. And that lack of information, historically, I've found, has been a real challenge, to be quite honest. The fear of the unknown, the fear of going somewhere strange, somewhere that's different, as you were talking about, Anne, outside your comfort zone. That's the first thing. But then on a very practical level, when you go to apply for a programme in a different jurisdiction, students in the Republic of Ireland are intimidated when they have to apply through the UCAS system, because there's that personal statement element that Irish Republic of Ireland students are so unfamiliar with through the CAO. A Northern Irish student finds the CAO like a maze to get through in order to pick your first choice and your second choice and what might happen in the various rounds. Totally unfamiliar territory. So you have all of those barriers that exist to mobility. And then, I suppose, adding, and you have the cultural issues that, Anne has alluded to, and other speakers earlier. Added to that, these days, parents increasingly are conscious of, tuition fees, the costs of sending students to higher education. In this region, and when I talk about this region, I'm talking about Louth, Meath, North Dublin, South Armagh and South Down. So this region, there is a real concern about cost of living and the price and the cost of sending students to higher education. And in Dundalk Institute of Technology, I can tell you that many of our first years they're the first within their family, whether they're coming from the Republic or they're coming from NI. They're the first in their family to come to higher education. So it's a big deal, and the costs associated with it are an incredible challenge for families. So therefore, things like the lack of clarity at the moment with regard to, the continuation of SUSI grants, for example, for students from NI is something that's, we're constantly being asked by parents, will it continue? Can you guarantee? And we can guarantee up to a particular time, but we're as much in the dark as everybody else. So I think, you have all of those issues that are there historically, and then you throw Brexit into the mix as well. And since Brexit was announced in 2016, it's clear that the number of applications coming in to the CAO from NI has decreased. It's gone down by about 10%. And the number of applications from the Republic of Ireland through the UCAS system, which could be into Northern Ireland or into England, Scotland or Wales, is down 18%. And that's the fear of the unknown, and I suppose the lack of a clear policy into the future in terms of how we're going to deal with the undergraduate level issues. So I suppose they're the constraints, or they're the obstacles, some of the obstacles that are in place. Oh yes, and of course the international student as well is going to be, there's going to be a difficulty there. Many of our students, for example, in this region, may wish to go on a field trip to Belfast. Well, that could be a difficulty. And there may be visa issues. So, the complications, we heard about that earlier from Bernadette, I think, in relation to migrant workers. The same applies to students. So, what can we do? Well, when Brexit came down the line, and obviously we were very conscious, given where we're based geographically, as a sort of a cross-border college, what were we going to do? So we integrated a strategy, we integrated into our institute strategy a plan that encompasses a shared region. We talk about shared island, we talk about a shared region, and that shared region consists of, as I said earlier, Louth, Meath, North Dublin, Monaghan, Cavan, our traditional area, but we also reached out and included South Down and South Armagh into our strategy. So we regard ourselves as serving the region. So trying to change I suppose, how we're perceived externally, we felt was really, really important. And 1 in 10 of our staff travel across the border every day to work, and we have many students who do the same. So it is an important cohort. They are an important cohort. And I've outlined, some of the obstacles there that exist. So what have we done over the past few years to try and alleviate some of those difficulties? Well, with regard to admissions, for example, we set up a working group to look at, in a very practical sense, to look at the application process. And we do encourage applications from Northern Ireland and from the UK. So, we looked at combining A-levels, applied A-levels, BTEC National Level 3 and OCR Cambridge Technical Level 3 awards for entry into our undergraduate programme. So we looked at what they were doing in Queen's, we looked at what they were doing in the University of Ulster, and tried to align ourselves in a very practical sense to make things a bit more transparent for the undergraduate considering coming to higher ed in the Republic. And, and just by something simple like that, like adjusting the scoring system, it resulted in significant improvement in terms of students applying to some of our programs. We set up open days, we invited principals, we invited students from schools in NI to come and visit. And then, obviously, COVID hit and we couldn't go on the road. And I have to say, that was the first time that we saw a dip in applications, just not being able to get out there, to get into the communities, all the things we were talking about before the coffee break really, really impacted. And but now, obviously, we're back on the road, and I have to say, we're sensing that the trend is in reverse. So maybe just in conclusion, in relation to undergrad, going out and being back on the road, talking to parents, what do they want? They want, and this is on both sides of the board, this is in the region. There is no border, it's a region, it's an education region. That's how I would perceive it to be. Parents have the same desires. They want their students to go to higher education. They want them to live at home, if possible, because of the fears of, well, we all know about the accommodation situation at the moment, and it's certainly far worse in Dublin than it is in this region. But most importantly, they want them to get a job when they graduate, and they want them to build a life within the community after they graduate. And certainly research has shown if students leave this region and they go to college in Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow or London, the likelihood of them coming back is very, very remote. So it's about talent retention within the region. And I think, as educators, we have a role to play in relation to that.
Big role. And Sheila, just extending it slightly, and I know your Institute of Technology has a particular role in innovation and research. And what about that area of, in terms of mobility of researchers, and are you seeing cross-border cooperation in that area? And maybe could you briefly give us an example of a successful initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Anthony spoke a little bit about this this morning on his panel. But again, obviously we would have concerns. We'd have concerns about the EU-funded projects, and we would welcome, like everybody else in the room, Peace Plus and the Shared Island initiative. But I think even before Peace Plus and before Shared Island, linkages had started on the ground between higher ed colleges on both sides of the border. And certainly, I think that trust and the relationships have built up over certainly I'd say a 10-15 year period. There's been a lot of through Interreg and various other funding sources. A lot of work has been done in that area, mainly in the STEM area, and I think there is an opportunity perhaps to move out into the more the humanities and the social sciences area, particularly if you want to get down into communities and to work with communities on the ground who, and I'm thinking, we've obviously this session is being sponsored by InterTradeIreland, and I'm thinking of the makeup of industry in this region, and again, I suppose Sam, has touched on it. They're small and medium-sized enterprises, and traditionally small and medium-sized enterprises, it's a lack of R&I, lack of research and development, and supports are needed in those areas. So I see opportunity with regard to that. But to give maybe a specific example, which is back in the STEM area, but then, as I said, most of the work that has, taken place thus far has been within STEM. In 2017, and this was all, although Brexit had been announced at this stage, this was built on a prior relationship that had emerged between ourselves and Queen's University in Belfast, where we set up a hub, a research hub, around a specific problem that exists within this shared region. And it's a health-related problem, and it was interesting to hear, the Taoiseach talk about, referred to, joint approaches to cancer earlier. In this region, there is, and it was only when I came up here I discovered it, there is a very high incidence of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, which is, obviously it's incurable lung disease. And researchers from Dundalk, from our research unit, the Network Casala unit, researchers in Belfast from the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Biomedical Sciences, and then we moved west, east, the Institute of Biomedical and Environmental Health Research in the University of Scotland, Western Scotland, where this problem also exists. We came together as a cluster to try and investigate the causes, what might be the cause of the high incidence of COPD in this region. And by the way, this is COPD not related to smoking. So we're looking at cases over and above smoking-related COPD. And the project has received €8 million in support through the European Union's Interreg programme. The three teams are working together. A world-class hub has been established called the Breath Hub. The Breath meaning Border and Regions Airways Training Hub, so it's very appropriate. So we have a cluster of researchers, we have a cluster of scientists, a cluster of clinicians, all working together collaboratively to try and identify the causes of COPD in this region, the possible innovative treatments for it, and possible prevention of it. So it's a very good, I suppose, example of a shared region identifying a problem and a collaborative cross-border, east-west, north-south approach to dealing with something that's very real and very pressing.
Very practical.
Yeah, very practical.
Research, good. Thank you. Just on the subject of successful research collaborations, and there's a very successful example called the Standing, it doesn't sound very exciting, the Standing Conference on Teacher Education, North and South. But I know in the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, we're very aware of all the work that's been going on there. And despite all the system differences, the shared agenda around the high quality teachers for the school system, and we've heard earlier about I think almost every speaker has mentioned some education and the importance of the education system. And I know that this initiative has across 34 member organisations since 2003. What's been the key to the success of and resilience of those relationships?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting example. I was struck, Sheila, when you spoke about reaching out to communities. I think a key question in mobility or engagement is, what is the unit of engagement? What is the first connection? And it was interesting that faced with the falling enrolment, you decided where you needed to go was to communities. And even the research engagement is around a community problem, something that's shared. I think within SCOTANS, because it has an acronym, so Standing Conference on Teacher Education North and South, which is since 2003 been one of the great success stories of the centre. I think it has sustained. I see Andy here as one of the champions of SCOTANS. It has lasted, and those 34 members include government departments, agencies, as well as all of the higher education institutions on the island of Ireland that support the development of teachers. The unit of engagement there, I think, is the fact that there are 3 places in the world, only 3 now, where entry into initial teacher education programs is competitive. That's Singapore, for all kinds of reasons to do with the culture of Singapore and the government of Singapore. Finland, again, strong in culture and history, and the island of Ireland, North and South. There are 3 places in the world where that happens, and I think that shared, if you like, focus is what has held SCOTANS together as a network. So we have a common imaginative heart, so to speak, and a shared focus on that continued commitment to ensuring that the teaching forces on the island, which are, bear in mind now that the teaching forces we produce on the island are also driving considerable parts of the Middle East teaching systems, Australian teaching systems. All of us who work in higher education institution will see our teaching graduates being wooed from around the world. Because of the quality of their English speaking for the most part, and because of the quality of what is produced. And one of the things I think that one of the features of the systems, and there are differences in the education system, but there's a strong commitment to high quality research-led teacher education north and south. One of the features is that we have a strong focus on the teacher as an agent of change. We have a strong focus north on south as teachers, on the relational aspect of teaching and teacher education. And we have a strong focus on the role of the teacher in their communities. And I think those three dimensions have served to keep that organisation together. The organisation has, because it operates at scale and an all-Ireland basis, it has allowed us, there's an annual conference coming up in October to engage with international speakers, but it allows Ireland to speak to the world on the matter of teacher education. It gives us a global voice around initial teacher education, and I think when we talk about cross-border mobility, we have, as part of that, we have student exchanges. So student teachers move into each other's institutions. They meet each other to talk about issues of commonality to teaching. But I think on both sides of the island, because our teachers are of such a high quality, I think, and because teaching and education is always part of the news agenda, that when the Taoiseach this morning mentioned, issues to do with attainment and particularly in areas of high poverty, we forget that the solution to that is in the quality of the teacher, and is in the person of the teacher. I think that on both sides of the border, we don't pay enough attention to what I call our shared island advantage. And that island advantage is our teaching force. There are other ones, but one of them is that the people who work in our schools, unlike in other parts of the world, the people who work in our schools want to be there. The people who work in our schools have been very well prepared to do so. And the people who work in our schools, for the most part, they became teachers because they want to change the world. And that is a huge social kind of engine within the systems. And I don't think on either side of the border we pay enough attention to that. Scotans, I think, helps keep that on the agenda. It gives it that global voice. I think if someone was to say, why has Scotans lasted so long as an initiative? I think it is because there is institutional buy-in, because there is that shared kind of value that we place on teachers and teaching. But there's also a campaigning heart, which is to draw more, to draw more attention to this aspect of our shared island. We talk about, the research potential. We talk about the innovation potential and the trade potential. But our teaching workforce is quite unique. Certainly in Europe, and I think it's something we could be doing more and saying more about as an island. I think, and speaking to the rest of the world who suffer chronic teacher shortages now, building into their system. And yes, we could all do north and south of the border with more maths teachers and science teachers, but the kinds of shortages that we might have are tiny compared to the rest of the world. And we are, on both sides of the border, inundated with what I call the educational tourists. That is the groups of people, government delegations coming into teacher education institutions to ask us what is the secret, like how are you attracting people into teaching? Now, salaries are good, pay and conditions are good, they could be better, I think that is a factor. But there are other things about the history, culture, and society in Ireland that values teaching, that sees teaching as a public intellectual, not just as a technical kind of technocrat that I think we could usefully do more on. I work in teacher education, can you tell?
Well, with a wife and a daughter who are both teachers.
There you go, yeah.
I can only endorse what
You
you
can,
say
of
about
course,
the
yeah.
teaching workforce.
If you want to go home safely.
I'll have to say that. Okay, Sam, coming back to you, you told us earlier on about the complexity of the movement of goods between Northern Ireland and the various parts of the rest of the world. Another big question, have you any views on what could be done about this?
So as I said earlier, I think over the longer term, companies, firms will just naturally adapt to the new conditions. This is assuming that those conditions remain stable, which is actually quite a big assumption to make. So I do caveat with that. In terms of what to do about it, I suppose I should first emphasise that my sort of inherent nature is to sort of accept constraints that have been placed upon me and then to try and make the best of it, to try and work out what to do. And I suppose an example of this is, so I said yes to attending this conference and then quickly realised that I'd actually said yes while my wife was away, and we have a 2-year-old daughter. And so my 2-year-old daughter is now with us here, actually at the beach, with my brother who came along to look after her. So that tends to be my approach. So what I'm about to propose doesn't fix the problem entirely. It just perhaps could help take the edge off. Because if the question is, well, how do we return to how it was before? The answer is, well, the UK either needs to rejoin the EU or needs to massively reintegrate its economy with the European Union. And those are things that the British government currently just does not want to do. In terms of other sort of conditions to take into account, both the UK and the European Union have accepted that unique arrangements need to exist for Northern Ireland. The current disagreement is over what those look like. The British government hasn't got to the point yet where it's saying that no, Northern Ireland is going to be in the exact same position vis-à-vis the EU as the rest of the United Kingdom. It's not actually said that, and it's not the British government policy. So with that in mind, I think we also need to understand that the protocol can evolve over time. Indeed, it already has since its inception. If we think about the issues around medicines, where for a while it was going to be the case that medicines authorised in Great Britain, either generics or advanced medicines, weren't going to be able to be placed on the Northern Irish market. The EU has since changed its own regulation to allow for that to happen. If we think about the tariff rate quota and steel issue I mentioned earlier, the EU is proposing solutions there that would allow the creation of a Northern Ireland-specific model to accommodate that. There's still some disagreements with the UK over how that would particularly apply in practice. So what I'm saying is that what exists now doesn't need to exist forever. It can improve, it can evolve, it can be replaced. And if we think about things that could be done practically speaking, the existing grace periods, for example, at the moment you don't have to submit customs declarations if you're transferring parcels from businesses in Great Britain to consumers in Northern Ireland. Everyone knows that's never going to change. The EU knows that's not going to change, but currently that's not being done legally. That is a unilateral UK grace period. Accepting that that is going to continue bilaterally, and we can apply that to other grace periods, for example, for supermarkets bringing in food products from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. They currently are allowed to make use of simplified procedures. Accepting that that is permanent and not going to change would add a degree of certainty that would really help. But then can you grow that further? I think, yes, you've had proposals from the UK on green lanes, from the EU on express lanes. They're talking about the same thing. The question is just whether you can have a movement of goods that is subject to reduced or even no controls, given everyone is happy with the levels of risk involved. And my view is that, as is the case now, you can currently bring in goods to Northern Ireland if you can demonstrate they will remain in Northern Ireland tariff-free. We've already accepted it's possible to prove things can stay in Northern Ireland for fiscal purposes. Can you extend that to the regulatory space so you don't have to apply the same sort of controls to food products from a regulatory perspective? Yes, there are always going to be some high-risk products that don't fall into that. The EU often mentions citrus fruits so don't include citrus fruits. Let's just work these things out. And then the other one I was saying, this requires movement from the UK, is what would really help would be a deeper veterinary relationship with the European Union, similar to what Switzerland has with the EU, which could remove the need for checks, regulatory checks on food products entirely. That would require the UK compromising domestically on its desire to diverge from EU food safety rules, both as they apply domestically and as they apply to imports. It would constrain to a limited degree the UK's trade agenda. My view is that resolving these issues in respect of Northern Ireland is more important. That's not necessarily shared by the current government, but it could change over time. But just to conclude, from a practical perspective, and again, I'm not qualified and not attempting to speak about the identity issues, I'm just talking about how do you take the edge off. There are solutions that could work, that build on existing approaches that have already been accepted, but what's required is goodwill. And from my perspective, that's just entirely what's missing at the moment. And in a way, if you could work out how to make everyone friends again overnight, I think a lot of these things would fall into place. But maybe we need more conferences and get people together. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Good. Well, lots of follow-up questions, and there may be some from the floor, Sam, or over lunch. But thank you very much. Just coming round full circle, Owen, to the issue of the differentials, the divergence in workers' rights. What strategy does the trade union movement have as an all-island body to address the concerns that you raised earlier?
Yeah, I mean, we can't have a situation where essentially 30% of our movement, the workers in Northern Ireland, are left behind. But, you know, I think we have to recognise the real problems we have. I mean, it's a tale of two experiences on the island. Things are by no means perfect in the Republic of Ireland, but we have a form of social dialogue where, in the public services, the state sits down with the trade union movement and reaches an agreement. We'll see if that agreement is accepted by the workers, by the members of the various unions. But it's a progressive way of engaging. In Northern Ireland, there's no one to talk to, and if you can talk to them, they don't have the cash to do the necessary. So, you know, the teachers that Anne's talking about, they're going to be on strike in the winter. The health workers, they're going to be on strike in the winter. The very same people who we all applauded and said were heroes, you know, protecting us during COVID. And I think they had a right, and this is public sector and private sector workers. And, you know, let's remember when we talk about essential workers, we always used to talk about nurses and doctors, but it's the cleaners, the porters, and it's the whole select set of workers right across the private sector as well. I think those people have decided, quite rightly, post-COVID, we need a new dispensation, and we are not going to accept business as it was. And I think in Northern Ireland in particular, we're going to see, as I said earlier on, quite a lot of strike action over the next period, in the public sector in particular and in the private sector. And we as a Congress are going to support those workers and those unions. We're launching a major campaign next month, Workers Demand Better, because they have a right to demand better. And they have a right to expect, when you have a government in Westminster that has clearly said they're not interested in working people in Britain or in Northern Ireland, and when you have no functioning executive here, what are workers to do? Is there a better way? Of course there's a better way. The better way is proper collective bargaining in the public sector and the private sector, where agreements can be reached on pay and conditions of employment, combined with serious efforts from the state to address the social wage, you know, making public services more accessible, more cost-effective for those who need them. So, you know, reducing the cost of transport, reducing the cost of childcare, reducing the costs that affect working families. And we're not seeing that at all in Northern Ireland, unfortunately. We're seeing a bit of it in the Republic of Ireland, but we're not seeing enough of it. So, in answer to your question, we cannot let the 30% of the workers we represent in Northern Ireland fall behind. I mentioned earlier on that employment rights is a devolved matter. That is a crucial thing that we want to work on. We met with the 5 political parties, 4 now, who will form the next executive. Their leaderships at our conference in Belfast made it very clear that should there be a new executive, the workers' rights clause, New Decade, New Approach will be honoured. Now, unfortunately, we have a tradition in Northern Ireland, it's a very long-standing tradition, that the political parties reach agreements and then we don't implement them, or we have a row over what they mean. That clause has to be operational, it has to be made real. We need to see, in the first 100 days of a new executive, a serious employment bill that promotes collective bargaining. We cannot have the state being a passive bystander. The state has to support collective bargaining. Unions and employers reaching agreements, particularly on a sectoral level, because we know the employments in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of micro-employments, less than 10. And the last thing I would say, the directive that I mentioned earlier on, that the Council are going to sign off on the 4th of October, there is nothing preventing a reforming progressive Minister for the Economy and a new executive saying, do you know what, we are going to look at that directive, we're going to take the best parts of it and we're going to put it in an employment bill in Northern Ireland. And incidentally, the day Theresa May triggered Article 50, we had a conference in Belfast, in Girdwood, and we had 4 of the 5 main parties there. And they all said, Unionist and Nationalist, they all said, if we have a situation where post leaving the European Union, there are progressive things coming from Europe around employment rights, we will not be behind the door in taking those elements and drafting them into local legislation. So we need to see those parties honour that commitment. They owe it to the workers of Northern Ireland, and we as an all-island movement who represent people from across the piece, different backgrounds, different cultural, different national identities, and we're proud of that. We have an obligation to them to make sure that no worker in Northern Ireland falls behind and that workers in the Republic of Ireland get the benefits of that directive.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Okay, thank you very much, Owen. Just in the last few minutes we have available, I think we have a couple of minutes. We could take a question or two from the floor from any of our speakers. So if you call for the roving mic, there's Mr. Darcy. What's to
Thank you. I don't mean to keep everyone from their lunch. I could. But 2 things. One, I want to pick up Owen's point about, as he highlights very much, we have an all-island labour market now, and I think that definitely there are opportunities for all-island social dialogue. As Owen said, workers' conditions, etc., are a devolved function. Therefore, that should make them also possible to be discussed under Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement as well, in some format or some civic social dialogue situation. But Sam, we so often hear this presentation of the London view, no disrespect to you personally, on where we find ourselves now. I'm old enough to remember why those complexities exist prior to the creation of the single market. It was created to eliminate those complexities for business. What's unique about the UK's behaviour is they have turned the clock back on 30 years of international trade agreements whose purpose was to reduce complexities as goods cross border. Now, the fact of the matter also is the protocol is not just a trade agreement, it's actually a political agreement to ameliorate the impact of Brexit on this island. So it's a peace and stability agreement. And it seems to me right now that what you're talking about doesn't take sufficiently into the full account of that fact. You've heard this morning everyone talking about a shared island. You heard earlier a very thought-provoking presentation, a keynote address from Bernadette, talking about the importance of the centre holding. The protocol and the Good Friday Agreement are holding the centre on this island, both economically and socially and culturally. And all we've had for the last 3 years in terms of the focus of the United Kingdom government has been on the GBNI dimension of this and the difficulties, in inverted commas, with that. The difficulty arises because, unlike with, as Owen referred to, labour relations, the UK government has asserted back to itself control of everything related to the movement of goods to the centre. There's no devolved dimension to this whereby there can be decisions in Northern Ireland that would be commensurate with the unique conditions of Northern Ireland, whereas increasingly an all-island economy. Because that's where the wealth creation, and this is the Northern Ireland Chamber of Commerce saying this, not me, where the wealth creation dimension of the Northern Ireland economy is actually taking full advantage of the fact it has the protocol to protect its trading arrangements and its business arrangements with the island, rest of the island, and consequently with the EU. I mean, I hear what you say about trade agreements. The EU has not been quick, but it has 70 trade agreements in place. And to take into account the effect of Brexit means renegotiation of them all. And in terms of the UK's trade arrangements, Newry's a lot closer than New Zealand when it comes to SMEs, particularly doing trade and business across the border on this island. The statistics, the Taoiseach quoted 7.5 billion for cross-border trade. The reality is that was about 2 billion only 3 or 4 years ago. It has multiplied. We've seen it practically on the road as well, travelling up and down. This is the protocol working. Also, by the way, I'm not sure your son could have come over unless he already had a visa that wasn't for the common travel area, which is also part of the protocol.
Okay.
So I just, but I think it's important in this audience, as Bernadette was said, to understand that what makes the protocol unique is the UK's approach to international trade and the fact that it ameliorates that. And the US government get that, which is why it hasn't been possible to negotiate a new FTA with the United States. And I think it's really important to understand that.
Yep. Please, Sam.
So I appreciate that you sort of heard people who sound like me talking nonsense about Northern Ireland over and over again. But if this is recorded, I'd encourage you to actually listen back to what I just said, because I don't actually think you responded to it. I think you responded to the legacy of everyone talking about, because I don't disagree with nearly anything you said. And actually within the context of, and read the paper I wrote, we look at all the different borders and sort of make the point that in terms of all Ireland trade, the protocol is quite beneficial. It puts Northern Irish business in a better position, for example, when dealing with the European Union and selling in to Great Britain than their equivalents in Glasgow and also in Dublin. It actually does create a situation for businesses in Northern Ireland that is quite beneficial under certain circumstances. What I was focusing on specifically in this context was how to improve it. And many of the things I was suggesting, I was talking about green lanes and express lanes, I'm using EU language there. These aren't outside the realms of possibility. The EU has accepted over and over again that this arrangement can evolve. Medicines, tariff rate quotas, how it applies on the ground now is very different from how it was first envisioned. It is a living beast, in a sense, that will continually evolve. And on the trade agreement perspective, the EU still has more trade agreements than any country in the world. It has more than the UK. The UK, once it gets in Australia and New Zealand, might peak over, but the EU is very good at free trade agreements. My point was solely that if you're an exporter on the island of Ireland, some of the rolled over free trade agreements that the UK has, because of the tweaks made, mean that it is easier to use them, for example, if you're exporting dairy, if you're exporting out of Northern Ireland than in Ireland. That's just an observation. So I hear you. I'm sorry you have to put up with lots of people sort of not really taking into account your perspective, but I really don't believe I did that. And I would encourage you to sort of listen back and read the paper I wrote.
Okay. To be continued over lunch, maybe. Any other final observations or comments? No, everybody's ready for their lunch. Okay, well, look, can I thank, on your behalf, the panel for their various contributions to the debate, and let's have some lunch.